From a mile away, you can tell that this is something extraordinary. The keen eyes will see a Volvo. The best eyes will see the Volvo 740. But how did Volvo end up with that quintessential 80s design recognised the whole world over?
Well, because it was cheap.
Chief designer Jan Wilsgaard offered many designs for the new car, but Volvo's production team wanted a saloon with flat edges and tight 90-degree angles, not because they knew better than their chief designer, but because they knew those were the cheapest shapes to make, and in the economic downturn of the 70s, tricks like that would keep the wolf from Volvo's door.
This all led to the Volvo concept car of the early 1980s, and that concept car pretty much looked exactly the same as the 700 series would eventually look. About the only thing that's different is the 700 series ended up being a little bit longer. So how does this angular shape fare in the roaring 20s?
To the surprise of many an 80s man, it's a bona fide classic. And classic status changes how you look at a car.
So right off the bat we can say that Volvo's idea of economy from the 1970s is pretty amusing, but you're not going to buy a 700 series for good fuel economy now. Volvo's famed desire for safety, however, might have held up quite well. You see, in the time it takes an impact to get from the front of the car all the way through this bonnet, past the steering wheel and into the driver, you've got more than enough time to just open the door and gently step out of harm's way.
But the chances of a crash that serious are slim when your bumpers are made out of springs. A resounding win for safety, but a Volvo from the 80s has one purpose.
The thing is, big boxy estates just don't really exist anymore. Modern estates are far too stylish. If you want this kind of space, you need to move up to a van or a big SUV, which does make this very interesting as a modern classic, because it's something you just can't get your hands on the modern market.
Even in the 80s, Volvo weren't known for being utilitarian. This car gives you quite a bit more than just a box on wheels.
Volvo released the 700 series to the world first with the 760, which was a little bit more luxurious and had more powerful engines, and then once the reputation of that car got on the road, they released the slightly simpler, slightly cheaper 740 to those adoring but more frugal masses.
The 740 may have been cheaper, but build quality and luxury carried through. Finishing touches like leather-backed seats and electric windows stopped this car being the Soviet-esque box it might otherwise have been.
This car even has heated seats, and after all this time, they're still warm. I honestly wouldn't expect a 40-year-old human being to still be this warm.
And seats were another thing that were just so much better in the 80s. Look at how thick and sturdy and comfortable they are. And when was the last time you walked into a showroom and saw an interior with this much blue?
And it's not just the colour. The entire interior is just very interesting. Instead of handles on the doors, you've got these big levers. The ignition is in the most inconvenient place it could possibly be. And then there's the design of the centre console. They angled the whole thing out slightly to make it easier to use, but it left this giant ledge on the top. And I love that a designer moved the dashboard, ended up with a huge gap, and just said, no, we'll have a cliff edge on top of the dashboard. Classic cars, classic Volvo. Let's be honest, you're not going to buy a Volvo 740 because you want something that handles corners and hugs the road. Having said that, the performance from the 2-litre Swedish block, coupled with an automatic gearbox, gives you a reasonable amount of power, as long as you can stomach the 20 miles to the gallon. It's a fiver gone. Unfortunately, the production team's tight hold of the purse strings does mean that engine and box are the same ones from the old Volvo 200 series. And while that's bad for the modernisation of cars in the 80s, those engines were bulletproof and just lasted forever, so you get the joys of that now. You might think all of that cost cutting means it's a very low quality car made out of recycled bean cans, but you'd be very wrong. The Volvo was made out of galvanised steel, which means it's one of very few cars from the 80s that hasn't crumbled into a pile of rust.
That's another win for the Volvo as a classic, because it means there will actually be some of them on the road to buy. The truth is, this car is a great classic, and it needs to be, because the 740 has been slowly disappearing from our roads.
It is completely terrible. If it were animals going extinct like this, if it were a Canadian albino lion or Chinese pandas that refused to mate with each other and the numbers were falling this low, the world would be crying out about it.
In 2011, there were over 5,000 registered on the roads in Britain. Skip forward to now, and we're down below 1,000.
The 740 has wedged its foot firmly into the door of the classic car world, and I for one hope that door is opened wide and it's welcomed, because car lovers need to make sure that number never reaches zero.